There's something very special about Martha's Vineyard that draws people to live here for part or all of the year. Its natural beauty and bounty, its community of people, or maybe just its islandness that's separate and different from communities and places on the mainland. People come here in different ways. Some are born here. They may move off island for a time and return. They may spend their entire lives here. Some of us come from away, perhaps originally as summer kids or with their parents who moved here, or as adults recognizing the exceptional qualities of this island, feeling the draw and choosing to make it home. However they got here, there are some people who truly embrace this place and give back to the community in many ways and over time. It's my great privilege and pleasure today to introduce 4 people, 2 posthumously, who have done just that, given back to the community in so many ways, helping to preserve the island's history, arts, and culture. They're the first of this year's MV Medal winners, Polly and Stan Murphy, and Barbara and Chris Murphy. I live in West Tisbury and was acquainted Don't get too excited, I got a lot more to talk about. I live in West Tisbury and was acquainted with Stan for many years, working at the West Tisbury Library when he was a regular patron, and with Polly from around town. I certainly was familiar with Stan's portraits, in particular one of 3 former West Tisbury selectmen that hangs in the town hall, and with his murals depicting island history at the Catherine Cornell Theater in Vineyard Haven. I feel I got to know them both much better just last year from their son David's retrospective slideshow of Stan's work. I met Chris soon after moving here in the early 80s at Vineyard Electronics, the Radio Shack store in Vineyard Haven, another one of my jobs. Chris is one of those clever people who repairs things rather than buy new, and was a frequent customer. We got to know each other over the switches and capacitors. Barbara I knew as a teacher at the high school, but really got to know her at the museum, where she comes weekly to volunteer in the archives. We talk about life and family, current events and politics, travel, and of course the project at hand. Polly and Stan Murphy, with their young son Chris, moved year-round to West Tisbury in 1948 after Stan's service during World War II, and a short time in New York City where Stan attended the Art Students League of New York. Both knew the island. Polly had spent summers as a child on West Chop with her sisters and cousins at her grandparents' home. It seemed like a good place for Stan to work on his art. In their early years here, they scraped by. Stan painted and peddled his art, sometimes door to door, offering to do a painting of people's houses. Their family grew as Kitty, Laura, and David were born. Stan picked up various part-time jobs to augment their income. They lived off the land and the sea. According to Sunday Smith, Polly's niece, Stan loved the people here and loved learning about the island. I think that his art is a reflection of what he saw here and his connection to it. His portraits present many different island people, young and old, and some of those portraits show us not only their features, but what was important to them. His landscapes portray the stone walls, meadows, and shorelines that make up the beauty that we all admire. Stan's interest in hunting and decoys led him to collect decoys and write the definitive source book on Martha's Vineyard decoys, now out of print and quite valuable. If you've got a copy, hang on to it. He served on the Chilmark School Committee and was an inaugural member of the West Tisbury Fire Department. Stan was involved with the museum, then known as the Historical Society, back in the 1980s. He was a member of the board of directors and served as vice president for 2 terms. He did quite a bit of work with the collections, inventorying the portraits and the decoys. His careful work done 3 decades ago is proving very helpful as the curators today work to catalog all of our holdings into an electronic database. Polly Wolcott Murphy was a writer, a cook, and a gardener. She cared for her family and managed Stan's gallery. She began writing as a young girl. Some of her childhood poetry was published in the New Yorker. In her teens, she was a young reporter for the Vineyard Gazette. As an adult, she wrote the Gazette's town columns for Chilmark and later West Tisbury, as well as feature articles. Stan captured some of her beautiful flower arrangements in oil paintings. Polly was active in the NAACP and in 1963 joined 4 other Vineyard women in a civil rights mission to register voters in North Carolina. Today, a plaque on the old West Tisbury Library, a stop on the African American Heritage Trail of Martha's Vineyard, honors Polly and her compatriots in that effort. Lindsay Lee has preserved Polly's memories of that experience in her oral history interview. Polly was also an inaugural member of the West Tisbury Conservation Commission. She was known for her wit, her openness, and warmth. As her good friend Ruth Kirschmeyer said, she had a remarkable ability to make everyone who was around her feel special. Chris Murphy grew up on Martha's Vineyard after moving here with his parents from New York. After college at the University of Rhode Island, he joined the Peace Corps and lived in India. He and Barbara married, and they lived in Rhode Island, where their 2 daughters, Hope and Mary, were born. They moved back to the island where Chris shellfished and inshore fished, although we can't say where, apparently, out of Chilmark until his retirement. He was also a bake master, providing many with a wonderful experience of a real New England clam bake. Today, Chris serves on the board of directors for the Farm Institute. He's on the Chilmark Zoning Board of Appeals, and until recently was a member of the Martha's Vineyard Commission and was vice chair and later chairman of the commission. In 2011 and 12, he led it through the contentious roundabout hearings and votes. I hope he's feeling vindicated today as drivers no longer inch their way through that intersection. He certainly suffered many dirty looks and worse from that political brouhaha. At the museum, Chris is an important piece of the fabric. He's the volunteer captain of the museum's Catboat Vanity. He guest curated the decoy exhibit last year, which included some of my personal favorite exhibit text, How to Fool a Duck. He chairs our programming committee and is a member of the planning committee for the Marine Hospital Project. Barbara Thomas Murphy was born and grew up on Martha's Vineyard, daughter of Bill and Mary Thomas of Oak Bluffs. She went off island to Simmons College in Boston to become a Spanish teacher, after which she and Chris married and lived in Rhode Island. When their 2 daughters were young, they thought of moving to Kuwait, where there was a job with fishing boats from the area in India where Chris had lived, and whose crew was Spanish-speaking. They didn't get that job, so they considered prospecting in Alaska. Luckily for us all, they moved back to the vineyard instead, where Barbara baited fish lines, worked at the Gazette and other jobs, and finally taught Spanish at the high school. Since her retirement, Barbara keeps plenty busy volunteering in the community and with her grandchildren. As she says, paying it forward for all the grandparent babysitting time she and Chris took advantage of. Barbara volunteers for Meals on Wheels program and was recently named as the Volunteer of the Year from Elder Services. She's been a volunteer at the museum since 2005. You'll find her name on many finding aids for the archives, and she's taken on the huge task of numbering and describing all of the photos for their inclusion in our collections database. The other day, I found her in the curatorial office scanning glass plate negatives. A little side story. Earlier this year, as I was working with a group of former teachers to create activities for first and second graders on life in the early 1900s, Barbara came in to volunteer. We had some photos on the table, spread on the table, and one was a fantastic shot of a classroom in Oak Bluffs with the children all seated at their desks in rows, and the desks were bolted to the floor. Barbara looked at the photo and pointed to the serious little boy in the front row and said, "Oh, that's my father." Wow. You can't imagine how thrilled the West Tisbury students were to know that that old photo of a little boy at school long ago was the grandfather of their assistant principal, Chris and Barbara's daughter, Mary. Barbara and Chris are intrepid travelers, managing to get away at least once a year for some amazing trip. And in the next year or two, when I finally grow up, I hope to be just like Barbara. Stan, Polly, Chris, and Barbara Murphy, to me, epitomize people who loved and love this island, its history and art, culture and sense of community, and feel compelled to give back, helping to preserve what we all love and what draws us here. I am truly honored on behalf of the Martha's Vineyard Museum to present the Martha's Vineyard Medal to Chris and Barbara Murphy and to the memory of Polly and Stan.
Hello. First off, thank you, Nancy. As always, you're wonderful. Chris and I thank you for this special honor, and we most happily accept it for Polly and Stan. Excuse me, I don't usually cry, but I have to say I am just a little overwhelmed. Okay. I've been thinking a lot about my in-laws and my parents, and how the past inhabits and improves the present and the future. When we are living our lives, we tend to focus on the realities of the time in which we live. It's only in looking back that we begin to understand what occurred then and how it influences us in our lives today. For instance, as Nancy mentioned, many times we unthinkingly took for granted what our parents did for us, whether it was babysitting, running errands, picking up children, etc. It's only now that we are approximately the age that they were then that we realize how totally important they were to us, our children, and our lives then and now. That realization colors what we do as parents, grandparents, and citizens. Because they gave us such positive examples of how to act, we try to emulate them as much as possible. The way the past influences what we learn and what we do in the present is also applicable to the Martha's Vineyard Museum. If we did not have its existence to remind us and teach us of what has come before, we could in no way learn so easily and well what to do now, or at least what possibilities can be explored and examined in our lives and in our community. We have been blessed to have the museum inhabiting our past, and we know that its presence certainly improves our present and also our future. Having reflected on the past, now Chris will expand on the future. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Wow. I got to say, it's fun standing up here looking around this room and seeing face after face that jumps out and says, hey, I know you. So I'm supposed to talk about the future. Here we are talking about our museum. It's growing from bits and pieces left in our attic, that was a quote from Alan Whiting, into the Historical Society, and eventually into the museum that we know today. Our historical record has passed through many hands. Today, it rests with us. It rests with us, with you and me, with this institution. We, as an extension of our community, have made the decision to build a bigger and better facility to house our artifacts and tell our story. I think it's wonderful. What a gift to ourselves, to our families, to our friends. What a great time to be involved with preserving our past by ensuring our future. I love volunteering here. The museum nurtures me in ways I had never expected. As we move forward on the grounds of the Maritime Hospital, there will be a great many ways we can all be involved in growing a bigger, better, more inclusive community. Now is the time for everyone in this room to reach out to your friends and neighbors and get them involved. The museum needs them, but not as much as they need the museum. Thank you, and thank you to all of you in the museum.